Let's begin.
Hey there, scary story fanatics. Welcome back to Cleaving Thought from Bone with your host, Sociopathic. It's time we get back to the lake one last time. To commemorate the last Locust Lake story, I figured I'd be here on location. So sit with me while I deliver to you the finale to the Locust Lake saga with Doughboy420's Locust Lake, Something Wretched.
Shiloh drifted through the endless darkness of the void. She felt nothing, just cold emptiness. She saw nothing, just blackness, endless dark. She heard nothing, only deafening, maddening silence. Then, far out in the darkness, she saw a pinpoint of light. A light that she desperately moved toward. She could see people standing there. She moved faster and faster toward the people standing in silhouettes of light until she could eventually recognize who they were. Ben, Michael, RayBob, Joe, Amy, and numerous others. But there were a few that stood out from the rest. A group of people that she only recognized from photographs that she had seen growing up. These people were her mother, her father, and their friends. All of the ones that lost their lives that day at Locust Lake. They were all here for her, and she felt at peace with everything. She had done what she had sought out to do, and put an end, once and for all, to the evils of the lake. But even so, she couldn't help but feel a longing for those that she had left behind.
It's not your time yet.
She heard her friend RayBob speak from within the crowd.
We'll be watching, you best believe,
he said with a smile. Shiloh then shot awake as the water was expelled from her lungs. She rolled over and continued to cough up the vile waters. She found a young man in some kind of uniform kneeling over her as she lay at the side of the lake. The man's uniform was a dark, smoky blue color, with a black vest full of pockets on over top, with an emblem of a red cross over it, indicating that he was a medic of some sort. Also on his vest was a name with simply a first name on it, Will. It was emblazoned in bold black lettering on the left side of his chest. An emblem of some sort could be seen on the corresponding shoulder. Another word that Shiloh couldn't quite make out, just the first few letters, I, C, A, and then the rest was obscured by the curvature of the medic's shoulder.
Who are you?
Shiloh asked, still a little woozy from the oxygen deprivation. The man introduced himself as Will. He couldn't have been more than a third her age. He urged her to safety, asking her if she could walk, as Shiloh began to notice what was going on around her. Several men in uniforms that matched Will's were moving in around the area with flamethrowers, burning away the locusts in the air to clear a path to escape from the lake. The flames roared forth, and twinkles of burning insects floated to the ground like burning feathers of ash falling to the earth.
What's going on?
Shiloh asked in confusion as the medic helped her to her feet and led her to safety. He assured her that they were there to help, leading her away from the lake, where she was met by her children and Gunner, who were all watching the chaos from the relative safety of the forest near to some of the cabins.
Don't call me ma'am.
Shiloh scolded the young man.
All right. How about Shiloh, then?
A somewhat gruff man's voice spoke from off to the side. The medic stood to attention, calling him Commander.
At ease.
The man spoke as he approached. He wore a long, tan-colored trench coat with a similar suit to the others beneath it. He had pepper-colored hair, a mixture of grays and blacks, with a matching mustache and short-haired beard. There was a scar across his left eye that ran diagonally across his face from above the bridge of his nose down to his cheek.
Do I know you?
Shiloh asked the mysterious commander.
Perhaps.
The man said before pausing for a moment.
Suppose you're all wondering what is going on here, and even though I'm not really supposed to say anything, I've got some real surprises for you. But first, we need to get away from the lake.
The man said before commanding his soldiers to withdraw and regroup. The men with flamethrowers continued to clear away the raging swarms as some of the rest of the soldiers made their way to regroup with the others. However, there were some that were not as lucky. The waters of the lake began to form waves that sloshed up on the shore. They grew bigger and bigger, water spilling at the feet of the soldiers as the lake grew larger. Floodwaters feeding into it and causing it to spill beyond its edges. Several large, pale arms reached up from the waves, clawed fingers curled and coiled, resembling the antlers of a pale deer. These unearthly appendages then impaled themselves into several men, ripping them off their feet. Some of them were thrown into trees and against cabins, their bodies crunching and splitting with eviscerating force, while others were yanked inwards to be devoured and drowned by the lake. The waters surged, and a wave of murky darkness crept across the road, knocking one of the dark-colored trucks belonging to the soldiers onto its side and scattering its contents. The woman of the water fought back with the rage that burned from the deepest depths of the inferno of hell, and many lives were lost as the remaining soldiers and the group of survivors fled into the forest back up the mountain once again. Only a little over a handful of soldiers remained alongside their commander and the other survivors. The woman of the water had wiped out dozens of people within mere moments.
Who are you guys?
Makenzie asked as they were led up the mountain.
We are Icarus.
The commander responded.
Icarus? What's Icarus?
Seth asked.
To the outside world, we are a glorified facility for the homeless. But in reality, we are a group of like-minded individuals that seek to protect the world from things that go bump in the night.
The commander replied.
That sounds familiar.
Makenzie said.
Of course. Your mother trained you to hunt things. What you did is not far off from what we do. But some of the things we deal with are much bigger.
The commander informed the young woman.
How do you know us?
Seth asked.
It is the purpose of Icarus to protect the world from entities outside of our understanding. And in order to do that, we have an extensive network of informants.
The commander responded. What's your name? Gunner spoke up.
To be honest, I'm glad you asked. Because I've been waiting for decades to let someone know.
The man spoke.
But sir...
A woman behind the commander spoke up, but she was hushed by a fellow soldier.
No, I think it is pertinent that they know. And I think it is pertinent that you all know as well.
The commander reassured her before continuing on.
It is against protocol for anyone at Icarus to speak of who they are outside of the Institute. But I have no life outside of the Institute. Because officially speaking, I am dead, and have been for years. You see, I was in prison for a long time. I was accused of murders that I did not commit. I had never killed anyone in my life. I was just a teenager when I supposedly started my murder spree. I escaped prison a few times. Remarkably, But I always wound up back in my cell. I was easy to find, though, because I wasn't trying to run away. I was trying to find the truth to clear my name. I filled notebooks with interviews and theories, and ended up hiding them all over the place. But in the end, nothing I found convinced anyone, and eventually it all caught up with me, and I was awaiting execution. It was just days away from me. I knew I was going to die.
The commander began to tell his story as they made their way up the mountain.
Then, someone from this organization visited me in my cell. I had no idea who he was, but he gave me a choice. Either sit in my cell and die for a string of murders that I did not commit, or leave my life behind and work for them. I had survived something that I shouldn't have multiple times, and that made me an asset to them. So, of course, I chose to work for them. My execution went off without a hitch, and I was pronounced dead at exactly 3:30 in the afternoon. But in reality, there was no execution.
The commander informed everyone. "What's your name, sir?" Gunner asked, with an odd look upon his face.
My name is Todd Jacobs.
The man said, calmly, causing everyone to immediately stop and turn to look at him. What did you just say?" Gunner asked in shock.
I'm Todd Jacobs. I was quote-unquote put to death for the murders here at Locust Lake. That's one of my journals you have there with you, isn't it?
Commander Todd pointed to Gunner's side where the old, worn-out notebook was stuffed into his belt. "Yes, sir, it is," Gunner said, completely awestruck at the revelation he was just told, as was everyone else there. All of them stood with their jaws hanging open, even his own soldiers.
And I take it you followed my clues?
Todd said, in a bit of an annoyed tone. Yes, sir," a dumbfounded Gunner answered.
That's what I'm afraid of. Have you killed any of the monsters here?
The commander asked. "Yes, we have," Gunner answered.
Shit. How many?
Todd asked with a sigh.
All of them.
Shiloh said bluntly.
So, Akanhayafte Oniga is the only one that is left?
Asked the commander in a serious tone.
Yeah.
Shiloh replied.
This is my fault. I didn't collect all my notebooks, and it's my fault you are here and this is happening. Shit.
Todd said with a desperate sigh.
It's alright. They're all dead. We pretty much won.
Makenzie spoke up.
No, it's not alright. And this is far from over.
The commander spoke.
They had to die. Their sacrifice was needed. That was the goal all along.
He added.
Their sacrifice was needed? Needed for what?
Seth asked.
Something is coming. I'm afraid we won't be able to stop it.
Todd answered.
We took out 5. What's one more?
Makenzie said confidently.
No. You don't understand. This is something different.
The commander said before the silence of the night was broken by a thunderously loud, shrieking howl that ripped through the air. Some of the soldiers were knocked off their feet by the sudden, booming sound from the sky. "What the hell was that?" a man asked from the group of soldiers.
Compose yourself.
A woman spoke to the man. The soldiers whispered amongst themselves, some of them determined, some of them afraid, but all of them wondered what the source of the booming sound was, and this was soon replaced by the soldiers falling silent once again to listen for a new sound from somewhere off in the forest. It was like a cracking, like tree branches snapping off in the woods. Then that sound was followed by several loud thuds. This pattern repeated as it grew closer, snapping, followed by a series of thuds, growing louder and louder as it grew closer and closer. The loud thumps could now be felt in the ground. Snap. Boom. Snap. Boom. The commander soon became aware of what was happening when he caught the treetops disappearing in the distance. Something was breaking off trees like they were twigs and dropping them to the forest floor to make way for its passage.
All right, everyone, we need to hurry. Let's move, people.
Todd commanded his remaining troops, and the group of them began rushing up the mountain more quickly.
What is that?
Shiloh asked.
That's what I was afraid of.
Todd replied, as everyone ran as fast as they possibly could up the mountain, but the sound of falling trees and rumbling of the ground as the massive trunks toppled to the forest floor kept drawing closer, until finally it came into view for one of the men. "What the fuck is that?" yelled a panicked man who turned to begin firing upon the approaching creature behind them.
Colby!
Yelled a female soldier who turned in time to see her friend get yanked back into the forest by what appeared to be a long, massive arm that just gripped his entire body and yanked him away from the rest of the group, where his screams and gunshots could be heard for several more moments before there was silence once more. Some of the soldiers stopped for a second and leaned back and forth in an attempt to see what was in the forest. Maybe they could help their friend, if they could just get a clean shot at whatever the hell it was that took him. Suddenly, a brutish giant of a man charged out of the trees to grab another man about his chest to lift him off the ground. Shiloh watched the scene unfold at just a few dozen feet from where she stood. The beast holding the soldier appeared to be Casper Stoical, but that wasn't possible. She watched him explode. In fact, she still had bits of him clinging to her body at that very moment. It looked like Casper, but it couldn't possibly be him, could it? Shiloh turned back in an attempt to fight back against the advancing behemoth, and as she drew closer to the beast holding the man off the ground by his chest, she noticed that there were things that were wrong about him. It appeared to be Casper, but it was just a bit bigger than Casper had ever been, and the thing's mask was odd. The stitchwork was more precise, more symmetrical in nature, as opposed to Casper's random, jagged mouth appearance, and the stitchwork X across Casper's eye was on the wrong eye. This was not Casper Stoical. Shiloh was sure of it. Shiloh reached for the shotgun at her back, took aim, and fired a blast right through the imposter Casper. A thunderous scream rang out from the distance beyond the fake beast. Somewhere back toward the lake, it roared. It was odd, but the group of them had more important things at hand. Several more soldiers took aim and began firing upon the monstrous being. The thing that looked like Casper advanced toward the nearest target, Shiloh. Shiloh ran as fast as she could as the beast charged toward her, but it was soon stopped by heavy fire of a man off to the right of the creature. Another rumbling roar echoed up the mountain from the direction of the lake as the behemoth imposter took its aim on the man firing upon it. Bullets tore through the beast as it slowly advanced toward the frightened man. He emptied a full clip and reloaded his rifle again before once more shooting the Casper look-alike. As the beast advanced upon him, it began to change. The man began to step backwards as he continued to empty his clip. Casper's mask melted away and was replaced with a head of ginger-colored hair. The decaying flesh of the butcher of Locust Lake oozed down into itself, and a new physique took shape. The thing's bubbled, tumorous flesh was replaced with smooth, freckled skin, and it shrunk from the size of a horse down to that of a fairly tough-looking woman. The ripped and rot-covered clothes were replaced by a clean white shirt and a gray dress that hung down to the ground, where it was met with the mud of the earth.
"Clifford?"
A woman's scornful voice called out, causing the man to drop his gun and stare at her in fear.
"Look at what you've made me do. My Sunday dress is all ruined because of you."
She yelled. I'm sorry, Mother. I didn't mean to, the man whimpered.
"You didn't mean to?"
the woman said mockingly.
"That's no excuse. You were a bad boy, and bad boys get punished,"
the woman demanded with a glare. "No, Mother, I'm sorry. I'll be better next time." The man looked down to the ground, his arms tightening close to his body to protect himself.
"You must be punished. Spare the rod, spoil the child,"
the scowling woman spoke. But you're dead. You can't be here. You died, Cliff said.
"Do I look dead to you?"
the woman said, her voice twisting from the voice of his mother to some kind of deep, guttural vocalization, as the woman's face also contorted and transformed into a fanged grin with hollowed-out eyes. The man screamed as the monster lunged upon him, his screams echoing across the mountain and causing the now scattered soldiers and survivors to stop in their tracks as a man screamed at the top of his lungs for his mother to stop.
What the hell is this thing?
Shiloh asked Todd.
It
Todd sightfully paused.
could be any number of things, really. Did anyone get a good look at it?
He added.
It looked like Casper, but it wasn't Casper. It was all wrong.
Shiloh answered. But, Gunner began. It looked like Casper. Why did we hear that guy scream that his mother was attacking him? He asked confusedly.
Good observation,
Todd said as he continued up the mountain. Visually, he was still trying to process what exactly they were dealing with.
I hope everyone else is alright.
A woman spoke. It was the same woman that was trying to get everyone to keep their cool not long beforehand.
I hope so too, Nadia.
Todd replied, as aside from Todd, she was the only member of her team that was present with Shiloh, Gunner, Seth, and Makenzie. The rest of the remaining soldiers had splintered off into two groups. One group consisted of a tan-skinned Indian man by the name of Kabir, a blonde-haired, blue-eyed woman with a grenade-covered bandolier over her shoulder. Her name was Kate, and the medic by the name of Will, who had helped Shiloh. While the other group consisted of only two. A lanky, thin man who stood about 6'3" named Nolan, and a light-skinned Asian man with two pistols in hand who went by Hinata.
What do you suppose we are dealing with here?
Kabir asked with an English accent.
You heard the commander. It could be any number of things.
Kate answered as she looked around into the forest.
Do you think the commander and the others are all right?
Will asked.
As alright as anyone can be, I would imagine.
Kabir answered.
Shh.
Kate shushed them, pointing to her ear, then off into the forest to their right, indicating that she had heard something. The three of them stopped and listened for any sign from that direction. They heard nothing but silence. A silence that was then broken by the echoing screams and gunfire, which sent them quickly running into the direction of the chaos. The trio found two of their teammates, Hinata shooting two pistols at a giant, worm-like creature. An undulating, segmented body writhed about and attempted to swallow his teammate, Nolan, whole. A mouth lined with thousands of little teeth dug into Nolan's flesh and bit further and further over his torso. Nolan's muffled screams could be heard from inside the beast. The bullets wounded the monster, but they appeared to have little to no effect on it. Nolan was clearly freaking out as he was being eaten alive by a worm-like behemoth, whose long body extended off into the darkness down the mountain. Then, from inside the creature, they heard a muffled gunshot as Nolan's body fell limp, allowing the creature to fully consume the rest of him. This was followed by a loud thunk sound as Kate retrieved a grenade round from her bandolier and launched it from her weapon toward the monstrous Helminthian beast, resulting in an explosion that nearly severed what could be considered the thing's head from the rest of its body. A loud, roaring scream could once again be heard from down the mountain toward the camp, and the ground shook a bit as the worm swiftly retreated back into the darkness, rumbling through the dirt.
What the fuck was that?
Hinata yelled in a mixture of fear, shock, and awe.
I remember Nolan telling me one time that he was afraid of worms eating him when he dies.
Will said, for some reason his memories being triggered by the event.
This is too weird, even for the things we do.
Kate spoke.
You don't think this thing is taking on the form of things we're afraid of, do you?
She asked.
I don't know, but you heard Cliff. He was scared, begging his mom to stop, and now Nolan... I think it's possible.
Will answered. This isn't some horror story where a clown is gonna jump out and gonna eat us. This is real, and in real life that shit doesn't happen. Hinata scorned.
You haven't been with Icarus that long. You have no idea what is or isn't real.
Kate corrected him.
You don't think there's actually going to be a clown here, right?
Kabir asked with concern, which got a bit of a chuckle out of the other three. Then, suddenly from out of the forest came a long, tendril-like string, which hit Hinata with a wet plop sound and became glued to his back before jerking him backwards off of his feet. The man screamed in fear and attempted to shoot over his shoulder, toward where he was being pulled across the ground. The rest of them opened fire with whatever weapons they had, but their bullets stopped, and they saw what was pulling Hinata into the forest. Kate froze when she saw the long, hair-covered legs clawing across the ground, digging into the dirt, and curling around the trees, ripping their bark from them. Two of the long, slender legs pulled Hinata toward the creature. Several crimson, unblinking eyes watched in thirstful desire as it pulled Hinata close enough to wrap him in the webbing that was already clinging to him, spinning him up into a cocoon of spider silk. The poor man screaming for his life the entire time before his cries for help were muffled by the silk wrapping tightly around his face, suffocating him within. This was followed by the monster's giant mandibles stabbing down into the side of the squirming cocoon, causing a pool of red to soak into the silk that surrounded Hinata's body.
Run!
Will yelled, grabbing a fear-stricken Kate and pulling her along with him. Kabir quickly followed suit, and the three of them ran as quickly as they could up the mountain. Meanwhile, the other group of survivors was nearly to the old stone quarry at the top of the mountain, and all of them were quite out of breath. Shiloh stopped for a moment as they reached a clearing near the top of the mountain. She had memories here. Painful ones. She felt as though this was one of her biggest failures, the death of young Joey. She couldn't protect him then, but she was different now, and she swore that she wouldn't let anyone else that she cared about fall to the monsters of the lake. And that is what she did. She defeated the demons, and now she had just one more beast to put a stop to.
My soldiers weren't prepared for this kind of mission. They were briefed on the monsters spawned by the lake. They weren't prepared for something like this,
Todd said as they made their way through the old quarry.
Speaking of something like this, what exactly is this?
Asked Makenzie.
I'm still not exactly sure, but it's looking more and more like what Icarus would classify as a Z-level threat.
Todd answered.
What does that mean?
Asked Seth.
a possible world-ending threat.
Todd answered with a sigh. What? Gunner said, stopping in his tracks.
Probably also a Y, and definitely an S. And it's looking to be a black-level threat,
Todd said, a bit nervous, kind of trailing off and talking to himself.
Mind telling us all that again in English?
Makenzie said.
It's a shape-shifting deity of some kind, and it's really, really bad.
Nadia answered. Wait, deity? You're saying this thing is a god? Gunner asked, in a bit of a shock.
Yep, and if we don't get to that road and get out of here so that I can come back with a better prepared group, then I'm pretty sure that thing will cause all sorts of chaos. We gotta put the really messed up rabbit back in the hat, or the world is gonna go to shit,
Todd said bluntly. It was then that they were interrupted once again by the sound of gunfire. The group of them stopped on the ridge overlooking the quarry below, in nearly the very spot where Joey had fallen to his death all those years before. They stood and silently listened, watching the path that led to the quarry. More gunshots followed, and then they heard screaming and shouting before they saw Kate, Kabir, and Will all emerging from the forest, shooting at something behind them. Commander Todd and Nadia shouted for them to join them on the ridge so that together everyone could flee whatever was coming up the mountain. But it was soon made very clear what was after them. 5 massive white fingers curved around a tree before another white hand shot out of the darkness toward the 3 soldiers firing upon it. There, those on the cliff overhead could see that the hand was actually clad in a white glove, leading to a frilly, almost lacy wrist of white fluff. This was attached to a long, almost accordion-like arm, clad in purple polka dots over a white background. The arm then folded back in upon itself, retreating into the darkness of the forest. Then, both arms shot out to grab a hold of the trees on either side. The other arm was very similar to the first, but this one was clad in purple and black stripes. Then came the thing's giant head. First, a fluffy, scarlet poof ball appeared from the shadows. This was connected to a giant, cone-shaped hat, covered in multicolored swirls and spirals. Frills similar to those at its wrists lined the rim of the hat. Then, from out of the sides of the base, came curly and fluffy tufts of hair at either side of the creature's massive head. 2 big tufts stuck out several feet from either side of the thing's head. They were a radioactive, toxic green color. The monster's face was completely pale white, so much so that it kind of glowed in the early morning darkness. The only parts of its face that were not colored white were 2 bright blue diamond dimples painted above and below both its eyes, and the pointed red mouth, exaggerated up toward the thing's white ears, and of course, the beach ball-sized red nose that stuck out bulbously from the being's monstrous face. The thing laughed hysterically at the victims that fled as it pulled itself along the ground after them, its laugh sounding like an unnatural cackle. Gunner grabbed a hold of the nearest thing to him, which happened to be Shiloh's hand. He had his badass moments, but he was still terrified of what they were up against. Shiloh looked on in shock and awe of the massive creature below them, gripping Gunner's hand as well. Todd and Nadia began to open fire on the beast, but it was little good, and it quickly grabbed a hold of its target. The terrified Kabir screamed as the monster pulled him toward it. The thing opened its massive jaws to reveal a mouth full of fangs that curled inward. The thing's tongue shot out to reveal another face on its end, a clown very much like its massive owner, but unlike the giant one appearing very jolly in a kind of twisted way. This one appeared very evil, contorted, almost demonic in shape. The clown tongue's bulbous red nose bobbed around as the tongue opened its mouth to reveal another set of fangs stretching down into its throat. And it was this head that bit down onto Kabir's screaming face, ripping it from his body before the rest of his lifeless corpse was tossed into the mouth of the greater clown, where he was chewed and swallowed with disgusting, bloody, saliva-filled mastications. Kate fired another grenade round in the beast's direction, exploding on his white face and blowing a hole into the gore-filled, pulsating inside. The monstrous clown reared up as it was sucked backwards into the forest, snapping off trees as it went down the small path it had squeezed through previously. Then came another thunderous roar that clapped like a shock of thunder through the sky and rumbled like an earthquake within the ground underfoot. Will quickly arrived on the ridge with his commander, followed shortly thereafter by Kate.
Good to see you guys made it,
Todd said.
What about everyone else?
Asked Nadia. Will simply shook his head and looked down.
I think we're the only ones, sir,
Kate answered.
Damn.
Todd said quietly, looking down toward the quarry.
So what do you think we're dealing with here?
Will finally mumbled.
Well, I think it might be a ZYS black level,
Todd replied.
Oh, shit.
Will said in quiet realization.
Yeah, this is bad,
Nadia said.
We have to move,
Todd ordered before turning to walk further toward their destination. I never imagined I'd be facing off against a god, Gunnar said.
Me either, but first time for everything, right?
Shiloh replied. Gunnar simply let out a nervous laugh with an equally nervous smile. The group of them began to walk uphill, but were then stopped. Out of the corner of her eye, Makenzie saw something odd. A flickering of light far off in the forest, down the mountain in the direction of camp. This flickering of light grew brighter, and then suddenly, without warning, illuminated the entire sky as if it were daylight. The blinding illumination flickered into darkness, like a light bulb in the dark, and then suddenly went black again. The group of them were terrified of what was down the mountain in the woods, and just the fear of it sucked their breath away and made their hearts race. They quickly made their way through the forest until finally coming along a clearing where tall power lines had been erected. Here, the lot of them had to stop and catch their breath. They had been moving uphill for who knows how long, and it was wearing on them. Their lungs hurt and their muscles burned. This decision would prove costly to them, though they were able to gain a few precious breaths of rest that they were not allowed much of. A twig broke in the forest nearby, causing them all to go on alert. Will we ever see the end of this? Gunnar asked in disgust.
No rest for the wicked,
Shiloh said, preparing herself for a fight. Then, from out of the shadows, stepped a familiar face. It was Hinata.
Oh my god, we thought you were dead!
Kate yelled, but got no reply. Hinata was soon joined by Nolan, who stumbled out of the forest behind him.
Nolan, you're alive!
Will said with joy. Both Kate and Will began to approach their teammates, but were stopped by their commander.
Something isn't right,
Todd said, holding them back. And he was right. Nolan stepped into the light of the newly rising sun, and they could easily make out the sight of a hole blown through Nolan's forehead from when he had turned his gun upon himself while being eaten by the worm. Hinata had 2 large puncture wounds, one clear through his flak vest and the other deep into his neck, creating a giant hole. Then from behind them came others, corpses of people in various stages of decay. Some of them were fresh and bloody, but unrecognizable, while others were completely gone, rotten away to the point where they had nearly become skeletons. The smell of rot filling the air around them like a lingering cloud of death that followed them wherever they went. "What the hell?" Gunnar said in terrified amazement.
"Here we go again."
Shiloh retrieved the machete from her hip and swung at the nearest walking corpse, striking it in the neck and lopping its head off. But this did nothing to stop it. The headless body simply kept coming, grabbing at her. Kate launched a grenade down the hill to blow a large hole in their ranks, but they just kept coming. It was as if everyone that had gone missing here at the lake was now emerging from the darkness, crawling up out of the ground and digging their way through the mud. The victims of Locust Lake now being used as weapons against the group of them. Todd, Nadia, and Will unleashed a hail of gunfire at the undead advancing upon them, blowing off legs and doing everything in their power to slow down the shambling horde. But there was nothing that could be done. Kate began to panic as the corpses moved upon her, their chomping jaws attempting to bite down upon her flesh. The terrified girl screamed and shook. She quickly loaded another grenade into the launcher and prepared to fire, but the ghouls around her were too close, which left her no room to safely pull the trigger. But she wasn't thinking clearly. She was nearly out of her mind with fear.
"No, don't!"
was all Nadia could get out before Kate fired off the grenade launcher in a panic. The grenade hit the nearest body, causing it to explode and tear through it, in turn tearing through every body around it, including that of Kate, who was ripped to shreds by the close explosion. The rest of them were given no time to react. The dead were now upon them, and they had no escape. Gunnar once again grabbed Shiloh's hand, attempting to pull her away from the undead thing, clawing and grabbing at her, but there was nothing to be done. All of them were apprehended by the decaying hands of the victims of the lake, and then, without warning, they found themselves being dragged through the forest at great speed. Branches brushed them and cut their skin as they were pulled back down the mountain, back down toward the lake, from where they had come. Nadia quickly reacted and fired several rounds into whatever it was that was dragging her along, causing the creature to lose its grip on her and drop her in the forest. She tumbled along the ground violently, rolling head over heels, arms and legs flailing violently through the air before coming to rest upon the ground. The remainder of them disappearing into the darkness, down the mountain. When they finally cleared the trees and came into view of where the lake should have been, they were instantly greeted by a very different sight. They were being held by long, flesh-like tendrils that all connected to a single glistening base that writhed across the ground before stretching downward into where the lake should have been. But instead of the waters of Locust Lake, it was a giant, gaping mouth of some great monstrosity. Rows upon rows of hooked fangs curled downward into its bottomless throat, and scattered about in a random fashion were eyeballs that appeared to glow in the faint light of the morning sun, like the reflective eyes of a cat. Hundreds of blinking and spasming eyes that stretched down its throat alongside its teeth. The beast's curled lips stretched around the edges of where the lake once was. Its massive tongue pulled them all closer to be devoured by the monstrous deity. They all looked down into the monster's bottomless throat. Teeth and eyes lined its insides as far down as they could see, and down, deep in its throat, they could just make out the sight of something else. Something squirming and moving around. As the movement grew closer, what it was eventually could be seen in the light. Hundreds of vicious-looking creatures were crawling their way upward from the beast's throat, climbing from somewhere deep in the dark abyss of its bowels. They were large, like horses, with locust wings, metallic exoskeleton-like chests. Their faces were like that of snarling, grimacing humans, whose heads stretched until the skin peeled away from their skull, where a bony growth pierced through. the cap of their skulls twisting and curving into points, bone turning yellow like some kind of grotesque golden crown. Their hair was coiling, as almost snake-like, appearing completely chaotic. They had long, segmented tails that were like those of a scorpion, a great, venom-filled stinger at the end. A new plague of locusts swarmed and dug its way upward from deep inside the belly of the beast. Unfortunately, it was Will who was first to be made into a feast. The poor man was dropped, screaming into the endless pit of the monster's great throat. Teeth writhing around him, and eyes constantly watching him as he plummeted to his doom, dropping into the horde of creatures in the beast's stomach, where they completely eviscerated him.
"Oh my god!"
yelled Todd.
"It's the amalgamate! It's the goddamned amalgamate!"
He yelled in fear and amazement.
"Its tongue! We have to sever its tongue!"
He yelled once more, which was easier said than done. All of them were currently being tightly held captive by branches of that very grotesque lingual muscle. The slippery, squishing sounds of the monstrous tongue, and the gurgling grumble of the beast's breath, and its groans, along with the screaming from the lot of them, was then joined by the sound of a hail of gunfire.
"Take this, you piece of shit!"
Nadia yelled as she ran toward the creature, firing her rifle into the base of the giant's colossal organ. The amalgamate roared so loud that it was almost deafening to them. The beast tossed its prisoners onto the dirt beside its lake mouth home. They all landed with a hard thud, knocking the wind out of some of them, but they had no time to nurse their wounds. Each of them had to react to stop this thing. The monster also reacted quickly, though. Every branch of its tongue spontaneously morphed into different shapes and sizes. One branch grew long, pale, white arms and legs, along with a head that had sunken-in eyes, empty eyes, and exposed teeth, skin clinging to bone like a skeleton beneath a torn, bright red coat that loosely hung around its body. Another branch shifted into a woman in disheveled office wear. Her skin was a pale, bluish, white color, and her bottom jaw hung from her mouth, nearly broken entirely away from her skull. Her tongue flopped about outside of the open wound of her gaping mouth, saliva dripping from her wounded orifice to the mud below. A third branch turned into a tiny wooden doll, oddly shaped with a hooked nose. All of its pieces carved out of single blocks of wood with thick, twine-like string that dragged through the muddy ground behind it. A fourth branch took the shape of a very tall man with a ragged black trench coat. His face was covered by a ragged, ripped, and burned old t-shirt, some odd design across its surface. He lumbered forward, his back arched over. Another branch formed into a massive behemoth of a man. A torn and burned, tan-colored overcoat was donned atop matching torn and burned, dark clothing beneath. Covering the man's wide head was a familiar black stitchwork hood, a crude mouth, and an X for an eye stitched to form a face. But once again, the X was over the wrong eye. A final branch took the shape of a small woman, covered in mud and furs, her eyes a raging red, blood trickling down her pale cheeks, her black hair hanging down over her shoulders. The branches had all nearly instantaneously formed into crude misrepresentations of the demons of Locust Lake. All of them similar to their original counterparts, but all of them poorly imitated copies of the originals. All of the branches of the tongue of the amalgamate pounced upon the attacking Nadia, who stood no chance of survival. They tore her apart, ripping off her arms and legs, pulling out her intestines, and bursting the balloon of her stomach. They pulled out her lungs and her liver, every bit of her body, ripping her to shreds of skin and bone. Her gruesome demise gave the remaining survivors enough time to retrieve weapons from the ground. weapons left behind by dead Icarus soldiers, the other victims of the lake, and the amalgamate. Seth immediately began shooting at the base of the tongue with a rifle that he had picked up from the road beside him. Makenzie was able to find a flamethrower by one of the Icarus trucks, which she strapped to her back and began scorching every bit of the tongue that she could. Todd shot the beast's tongue with his own pistols, blowing large holes in the base of the lingual muscle. Gunner lived up to his name and took control of a .50 caliber mounted rifle in the back of one of the Icarus vehicles and opened fire on a concentrated point of the colossal appendage. All of them desperate to cease the advance of the demonic locusts that drew ever closer, clawing their way upward from the abysmal belly of the amalgamate, all of them trying to close the literal hell mouth before them. As the beast roared in pain, Shiloh picked up a grenade launcher from the road and fired it at the tongue of the amalgamate. The creature's tongue flailed about, its many branches writhing around like tentacles, and it reacted to Shiloh. A colossal mouth formed at the end of the beast's lingual appendage, and it rocketed downward into the ground, driving Shiloh's entire body down its tongue throat and digging its teeth into the dirt around her to scoop her up and devour her whole, swallowing her down into its stomach. Makenzie and Seth stopped for a moment, their eyes filling with tears as they saw their mother being eaten alive.
Mom!
Makenzie yelled.
No.
Seth sorrowfully sighed. The two of them began firing upon the base of the tongue with even more fervor, the rage fueling them. Gunner and Todd joined them, shooting away chunks of the massive colossal muscle. The sound of gunfire mixed with that of the roaring and screeching and clicking locusts that climbed upward from the throat, teeth and eyes curling and darting around to watch them as they ascended. The giant tongue swung about and slammed into them. It knocked Gunner's truck completely over on its side, throwing him clear of it, and it swatted away the others like flies. It was too big. It could not be stopped. There was nothing that could be done. It was when all hope was lost that the colossal tongue reared back and curled in upon itself, almost as if it were trying to pull something out from its internals. Then, from the inside of the writhing appendage, came a rumbling boom as a bubble began to form from inside it before it finally burst like a disgusting zit and gave way. Fire and smoke escaped from the large wound, along with blood, saliva, and other viscous fluids. A second explosion from within the lingual muscle caused the tongue to completely separate from its base. The end of the gargantuan tongue flopped down onto the ground as the rest of the tongue writhed about, spewing blood everywhere like a rogue fire hose. The amalgamate screamed in pain, its eyes spiraling around in fear as if it were trying to find an escape. Then the beast's teeth began to fall out one by one, dropping down into its throat, followed by its eyeballs popping out of their sockets and plummeting down its gullet, crashing into the beasts as they now desperately advanced towards the surface as their gait crumbled around them. The ground rumbled as the lip-like structure of the mouth curled inward and the monster began to collapse in upon itself, its flesh falling inward before it began to liquefy. The creature's skin bubbled and turned to a thick, bloody liquid. This bloody liquid began to thin out and lose its color, becoming more like water. Pools formed in the flesh and grew larger as the skin around them jellified, and then also turned to liquid. Slowly but surely, the entire form of the amalgamate turned to water, until finally the gate was closed. The devilish locusts could no longer be heard, and the monstrous god was awake once again. Makenzie collapsed to her knees, sobbing. They had won, but their mom was gone. Her teacher was no more, and she felt as though she had lost. Seth joined his sister, putting a hand on her shoulder and doing his best to comfort her. But inside, he hurt just as much as she did. Todd stood in shock of what had just transpired. They had just somehow defeated a god, and he knew it was Shiloh that had done it, taking out the monster from the inside. It was Gunnar, though, that came across something miraculous as he climbed out from behind the overturned truck. As the remainder of the flesh of the tongue melted away and returned to water, a form began to take shape beneath it. Quickly he reacted, peeling away the membranous, liquidy flesh from the woman's body and began checking her for signs of life. He immediately went into action and began performing CPR upon Shiloh, pushing onto her chest and breathing air into her lungs until she finally coughed up a mouth of gooey liquids. She took in a sharp breath and looked around in confusion. Her lungs burned from being filled not once, but twice in the same night with invading liquids.
Did we do it?
Shiloh asked Gunnar through sore vocal cords. Yeah, we did, he replied with a smile, and she returned this with a tight hug, pulling the man closer. Todd noticed the reunion and motioned for Makenzie and Seth to take a look.
Mom!
Seth yelled.
Oh my god, Mom!
Makenzie also yelled with joy before Seth pulled her to her feet and the two of them ran over to be with their mother. She was alive, and they had done it. They had defeated a god, and more importantly, they had put an end to the demons that had brought them all there to begin with. It was over. The water was cleansed and reborn anew. The land was at peace once again. They had finally done it. For them, the evil of the lake was over. They could move on and live their lives, but even though this was the end of their story at the lake, they knew that there were still other things out there. Other things that go bump in the night. And now it was their turn to help others with their demons. The evil of Locust Lake was finally dead and gone. But does evil ever truly die?
Well, it is true that evil never truly dies. It only rests a while. So don't you fret, not only is darkness still stirring, but we've got some epic things planned on the way, so don't go anywhere. Thank you for checking out tonight's story. I truly hope you enjoyed the Locust Lake series, and as always, I'd like to see you again next weekend. So don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications so I can catch you all again next Saturday.